With that, we can probably go ahead and get started. So for everybody that is still coming in, thank you for joining us today for the Ransomware Reloaded, exploring 2025's latest threats. I am joined today by not one, but two members of our adversary research team here at AttackIQ. The first is engineering manager Andrew Costas, and the second is adversary research engineer Ian Rogers. Thank you both for joining us today. I will hand it over to you.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Liz, for the warm introduction. And yeah, just want to start off by thanking everybody that have taken the time out of your busy schedules today to dial in and listen to this, hopefully, what will be quite an interesting talk with my awesome co-worker Ian Rogers. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the agenda. So plan for today, we'll go through some quick introductions so you have some idea of who your speakers are for today. Then we'll be given a brief overview of the AttackIQ adversary research team. We'll be then moving to talk about why we're still talking about ransomware in 2025. And then we'll kind of get into the heart of the presentation where we'll be diving deeply into the technical details behind some of the most prolific ransomware groups that have been on our radar in recent months. Then towards the end, we'll be talking about some additional scenarios that have been added in recent times, as well as some general best practice and guidance around mitigations for how you can better prepare yourself for ransomware. And finally, if we have time towards the end, we'll certainly open it up to some questions. So let's jump into the quick intros. So the person that's speaking with the funny accent, my name is Andrew Costas. I am in fact from the UK. I'm the manager of the adversary research team, and I've been at AttackIQ for 4 years. So I previously was working at VMware Carbon Black in the threat analysis unit, where I spent much of my time reverse engineering ransomware and malware and tracking various threat actors. And I'm joined today by Ian Rogers. Ian, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Ian Rogers. I'm on the adversary research team here at AttackIQ. I've been on ARC for about a year now. Prior to that, I was an incident handler. I got my start in higher ed doing incidents for a research institution here in the US, and then I switched over to more offensive work as a pen tester. So, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, privileged to have you join me on the webinar today. So let's dive in then. So bit of background. I'm sure some of you on the call or listening at a later date are probably already familiar with what the adversary research team are and what we do. But I just want to spend a few minutes just talking briefly for those that are not so familiar. So the adversary research team, or often referred to internally as the ART team or ART. So we are a globally distributed team of cybersecurity experts. We, believe it or not, we span multiple continents, countries, and several different time zones. And this actually is one of our many strengths because it enables us to work on high priorities and particularly emerging threats and CISA alerts that obviously come up with next to no notice, but it allows us to continuously work on these high priority items around the clock. And secondly, it provides us with a global perspective of the threat landscape. And that's really important because, we obviously have a global customer base, and then we also have a global team. So we have lots of different perspectives and lots of insights into what's relevant, what's becoming more prevalent, and what should be of a concern to not just us, but more importantly, our customers. So obviously, as a team, we possess a very diverse range of cybersecurity skills. So, like many of you on the call, we've spent our time, we've certainly earned our stripes working in the trenches at previous companies in various capacities, from red teaming, blue teaming, reverse engineering, malware, CTI, threat hunting, and so on. So we kind of understand very well what the kind of day-to-day challenges are, right, of our customers. And we use that knowledge to ultimately help us to understand our customers' cyber challenges from their perspectives. And so by the very nature of the work that we do, we are constantly reading, assessing, reviewing, researching new TTPs, tools, techniques, sub-techniques, as well as threats, adversaries, campaigns, and so on. And just stating the obvious, but just like everybody else in the community, we care a lot about the latest threats. This is really fundamental to what we do as a team. So in terms of our priorities, we pay particular interest to, of course, emerging threats and new campaigns. But we also provide rapid response for CISA. So those of you outside of North America or the US, CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They're a great organization, and every now and again, with no notice, they put out cybersecurity advisories, otherwise known as CSAs. These advisories are often either written up by CISA themselves, but more often they're also joint collaboration pieces that involve multi-international agencies from around the world. What's interesting about these advisories is that they're often based on real-world intrusions and real-world incident response write-ups. So they're very relevant and they're very timely, and they actually cover a range of both nation-state as well as e-crime, and particularly their Stop Ransomware themed advisories are ones that we also pay close attention to. So, and finally, we respond to and obviously prioritize customer and field requests for specific content covering bespoke use cases, particularly when customers or prospects are concerned about specific threat actors, ransomware groups, information stealers, and so on. So everything we do is ultimately to aim to release timely, relevant, and actionable content that is designed to be safely run in production environments and, of course, at scale. So ultimately, as a team, what we essentially practice is this kind of principle called threat-informed defense, which is a continuous cycle of understanding real-world adversary behaviors from the adversary's perspective. And then what we do is we use that knowledge to evaluate our own systems in our lab environment based on those real-world threats. So by practicing this threat-informed defense in-house, it actually results in us releasing content so that our customers can effectively do the same in their own environments, and they can then assess their performance of their security controls, identify gaps, and not just necessarily in the controls or the technology, but also the people and the internal processes and so on. So what exactly is content? So content comes in a few different forms. Scenarios are the individual atomic tests, which can test a single technique or a sub-technique, which is often aligned to MITRE ATT&CK. So you can think of scenarios as the building blocks which are necessary in order to populate an assessment. So moving on to assessments, there's actually two types of assessments. So atomic assessments are comprised of one or more scenario, and these atomic tests are useful when maybe only there's a subset of available TTPs that have been identified or, for example, publicly reported. So they're quite useful for emerging threats, but they're also useful for things like security baselines and stuff like that. The second type of assessment are attack graphs. So these are assessments where the individual scenarios are in fact actually now related, or in other words, they are chained together. And so depending on the logic, the security controls would then hopefully either prevent and or detect various scenarios along the attack path. And you can see that based on the image here, that there's a bunch of green and red lines, which are kind of the logic that kind of dictates the path of the attack graph, depending on what scenario is prevented or not. So fundamentally, depending on which TTPs have been observed for a given threat, the ARC team will then either reuse existing scenarios from our incredibly vast scenario library, or we will create new scenarios based on new TTPs. And so by kind of iterating and following this continuous cycle, we will then create an applicable assessment, whether it's atomic or an attack graph, based on those real world observations and sightings. We will test this in-house against our own controls. And finally, when it's ready for release, we will release that content to production. Typically in parallel, we will also release a blog post as well. But amongst many other things that we do in terms of content, we also lend a hand in various other aspects of the product in terms of innovations, developing internal security tools, and many more things. So I read recently that according to a report in February of 2025, ransomware payments are on the decline, and less than half of recorded incidents resulted in victim payments. Well, that's kind of on the surface, that sounds like really good news. So why on earth do we even need to be given this talk today on ransomware in 2025? So despite that fact, ransomware, sadly, is very much still out there. And as we all know, it can manifest into causing various damages to your organization. So typical examples of that would be financial impact, business disruption, downtime, data loss, reputational damage, and even legal consequences, perhaps in the form of compliance rule breaks or fines. So there's lots of other reasons as well, but these are the reasons why ransomware is still very much top of mind for many organizations. Compounded by the fact that there are still new groups that are emerging on the scene in 2025. And sadly, despite successful law enforcement efforts and takedown operations, which, in my opinion, is fantastic news, as we know, this is not necessarily stopping the bad actors. It is certainly a level of deterrence, and it perhaps causes a bit of disruption on their side of the house. But sadly, it's not really preventing the overall situation with ransomware. Then add into the fact that threats are obviously becoming more sophisticated, and with a relatively low barrier to entry for cyber criminals, it's still quite a very lucrative or highly lucrative area to operate in. And finally, despite a decrease in ransomware payments, this could in fact lead to more aggressive tactics. We've seen, I think only last year, we saw a group that has actually modified their tactics, and as ransomware payments are on the decline, which is definitely a good thing, that doesn't necessarily stop determined actors from seeking out new ways and novel methods to ransom their victims. So ultimately, the takeaway here is that ransomware is very much not going away anytime soon. So with that, we're going to now dive more into some of the details, and we're actually going to be talking about 6 of the most prolific ransomware groups and the content that we've released in association with those groups. So starting off with the first one, I'll hand over to Ian to talk about Hunters International.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so starting the year off, Art covered and released a blog and content related to Hunters International Ransomware. So Hunters International Ransomware is a group. They operate a ransomware as a service operation. They also conduct double extortion, and they've been active since 2023. In Rapid7's 2024 ransomware radar report, they ranked number 7 on the most posts on their data leak site. And in terms of their tactics, their initial access vectors are typically known public exploits and phishing campaigns. And once they're inside, they use legitimate tools during their operation, as well as custom scripts to evade detection. Initial reports suggested that Hunters International was a rebrand of Hive due to ransomware code similarity. There was about a 60% overlap with known samples of Hive ransomware. But Hunters International actually refuted this on their data leak site. They claimed that they purchased the code and corrected some issues that prevented file decryption, and also rewrote the ransomware with Rust. And that allows it to work on x86, x64, ARM, and for Windows and Linux-based OSs, including ESXi. The group claims that the encryption is not their primary goal, but they rather focus on data exfiltration. And so if we take a look at the actual attack graph that was created for this, so this was based off of this is a malware emulation based off of some reporting done. To note, Hunters International will delete shadow copies to prevent system recovery. And interestingly, the ransomware had a predefined list of services that it attempted to terminate prior to actually running encryption, mostly databases and backup recovery tools, simply just to ensure that the encryption was complete across all file types. So, and they're using native API calls specifically to get a list of running services and comparing that to that internal list. So,
cool, thanks, Ian. And then we'll jump now into Ghost ransomware. So Ghost or Kring ransomware operators, they've in fact been active since early part of 2021. So CISA released a cybersecurity advisory actually towards the end of February time, So they've been around for quite a while, but they're still very much an active threat. They go by many different names, but Ghost or Kring are the ones that are most commonly used that reference them. It's believed that the actors are actually based in China. They have many different, or they've been responsible for many attacks over more than 70 countries, which actually include China as part of that. But most of their targeting seems to be more focused around organizations in both Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So they're not too concerned about persistence, but they have been observed deploying ransomware the same day as the initial intrusions actually happen. So they're quite quick. Once they're in, they go to work pretty quickly. They're also known for primarily targeting outdated publicly facing systems, so notably Fortinet, Adobe Cold Fusion, Microsoft Exchange, and Microsoft SharePoint, to name a few. They have also been known to use custom PowerShell and batch scripts, particularly around disabling Microsoft Defender. In terms of the attack graph that we released in response to the CISA advisory, we released an attack graph. Ghost operators are known to use Cobalt Strike, which you see at the start in the first row, if you like. They have a very heavy dependence on living off the land tools, for example, WMI and Remote Desktop Protocol. They also have gone to great lengths to disable Defender. As you can see in the middle kind of section of the attack graph, they use a bunch of different techniques to obviously bypass defenses, and that ultimately then leads to a full compromise and infection of the Ghost ransomware payload. All right, Ian, back to you for Akira.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so Akira Ransomware is a ransomware as a service group, and they also emerged in 2023. And some reporting in 2024, and in a year's time between 2023 and 2024, the group claimed approximately 42 million USD in ransomware proceeds. In 2024, they also ranked among top 5 most active ransomware groups. Uniquely, Akira offers victims the opportunity to pick and choose what they pay for, data deletion or decryption assistance, or both. There was some code similarity noticed between Akira and Conti, particularly around string obfuscation, encryption routines, and file extension exclusions. However, because of the Conti source leak, it's hard to say for sure. Other reporting has identified certain crypto wallets being reused between both Akira and Conti, potentially indicating that one or more individuals joined Akira after Conti disbanded. Their initial access is usually through VPN with accounts obtained through phishing or other means, and they also use publicly known exploits. Other reporting suggests the US is their most targeted country in their leak site, or from their leak site, and they largely affect the manufacturing sector. So looking at the attack graph that we released for Akira, this is another malware emulation. Similarly, deleting shadow copies is a common tactic to ensure that your encryption is complete of a system. And it's also using Windows API functions to identify drive types currently connected to the affected endpoint, so that it's not just encrypting with your C drive, for example, it's any other connected media. And yeah, they're using Cha-Cha-20 for file encryption. So
Cool, thanks, Ian. Yeah, and it's certainly a common theme that we see with many ransomware groups, and certainly the payloads is a lot of overlap in terms of deleting volume shadow copies, for instance, using living off the land tools, and particularly when it comes to the payload itself, heavy utilization of native API. So let's dive right in to the next example. So we have RansomHub. So RansomHub, they are a ransomware as a service operation that emerged early in 2024. They recently, sort of recently, back in August, became on the radar of CISA again. So CISA released an advisory, and we released some content back then, but we also released some updated content a couple of months ago, just because of their high activity and the fact that they're also known for their kind of big game hunting tactics and operations. They've had some pretty sizable victims, including Change Healthcare, Christie's, and Frontier. And they're actually the second most, I think they contain the second highest number of leak sites posted in 2024. So initial access usually comes in the form of exploits of known vulnerable edge devices, typically using FortiGate and Citrix ADC. The ransomware is typically written in the Go language, which is typically streamlined for performance. And it also allows it to target a variety of different operating systems without having to rewrite the code base to run on both Windows and Linux and various other operating systems. So RansomHub is suspected to be a rebrand of Night ransomware due to, again, code similarities between the ransomware and also the timing of RansomHub's emergence and the Night ransomware source code sale. One of the distinctive characteristics specifically to RansomHub is that the actual ransomware binary requires a password to execute and encrypt the files, and this obviously makes it for a bit of a tougher time for the malware analyst having to analyze that. But RansomHub is thought to have recruited affiliates after a exit scam by Black Cat Ransomware as a Service group. And according to actually a very recent article posted earlier this week by GuidePoint Security, RansomHub's chat and data leak site have apparently been unavailable since March, the end of March. So their future currently remains unclear, despite being one of the key heavy players throughout 2024 and certainly for the first quarter of this year. In terms of their attack graph, again, kind of already mentioned, but very prolific on the use of living off the land techniques, particularly around clearing the Windows event logs to hide their activities. Again, you'll see some commonalities. That's not to say all ransomware payloads or intrusions are the same, but we often do see very similar patterns in terms of the deletion of volume shadow copies, setting up persistence through the Windows registry, and again, the many uses of Windows native API function calls. Next up, we have Medusa. So again, this was another CISA alert that came out only last month. They've been pretty active for as far back as June 2021. This group initially started out as a closed group where all development and associated operations were controlled just by that one group. But as of February 2025, so only last month or a couple of months ago, the developers of Medusa and the affiliates have impacted over 300 organizations. So they've been on the scene for quite a while, but they're still making quite a big impact in this space. So the most impacted sectors include technology, education, healthcare, medical, and manufacturing. And they actually, in fact, interestingly, they have a media team, and they often post victim information on their Telegram channel. So again, very heavy on living off the land techniques to try and blend in with business usual activities. And the group often leverages initial access brokers to obtain initial access to their victims. Again, very heavy usage of exploiting vulnerable public-facing systems and appliances. And in fact, they are in one of the top 10 ransomware groups in terms of number of leak sites posted in 2024. And that brings us to our last, I forgot about this slide, sorry. This particular CISA alert, actually, despite them being around for a long time, some of the reporting was not as forthcoming. And we do see this from time to time. So we can't, we don't like to infer and just invent an attack graph if it's not based on real world adversary behaviors, because, ultimately that defeats the point of testing, in production and testing actual security controls. So this was one of those cases where we had, limited information, but as you can see, we still have pretty good coverage across the MITRE attack, particularly around these tactics and various techniques that are shown on this slide. So last but not least, we'll move on to Lockbit. Ian, over to you again.
Thanks, AC. So yeah, Art released recently a download and save atomic test of known Lockbit 4 samples. But just to talk about the group briefly, they've been active since 2019, operating as a ransomware as a service model. Lockbit was the most active ransomware group by number of victims posted on their leak site in 2022, and that persisted in 2023, and then in 2024, they were the they sorry they also had the most number of victims reported on their leak site in 2024. They've done a number of publicly generated or publicity generating activities over the years, including paying people for getting Lockbit related tattoos or hosting bug bounty programs to improve their ransomware, or offering $1 million to anyone who could provide information related to the real world identity of their leader, Lockbit sub. Um, in 2024, in February, Operation Kronos, led by the NCA and FBI, disrupted Lockbit's operation by seizing the group's infrastructure, including their leak site. They also seized data or their decryption keys, which led to the creation of new decryption tools to assist Lockbit victims. Operation Kronos led to 2 different arrests. And despite this disruption, like I had said earlier, they had the most number of victims posted on their leak site last year. In terms of the download and save atomic test that we had released, there had been some recent reports detailing the new Lockbit 4.0 or Lockbit Green. Um, Despite the lack of public intelligence, there's still value in testing just download and save samples against your infrastructure. And Art is currently working on emulating some defense evasion techniques exhibited by the new Lockbit samples, such as proxy DLL loading and bypassing event tracing for Windows telemetry infrastructure. We're going to continue to track Lockbit related activities and release new content as we learn more. And now I just want to speak a little bit about new scenarios that we developed or has developed in the first quarter of this year. And related to impact scenarios, Art created a customizable collect and encrypt files scenario. This allows you to customize both the symmetric and asymmetric encryption algorithms on a so for a given threat actor, depending upon what they're using, it could make this scenario more realistic in that application. You can also exclude specific files or include specific file extensions with this scenario. And because we're allowed or we intend to run in production, we're creating backups of all files before encrypting them and then reverting them upon scenario completion. And we can restore the timestamps as well if that's a selected option when the scenario runs. In terms of new discovery scenarios, there were a lot of new Windows API-based scenarios. For example, we're seeing a lot of different ransomware use NetUser enum, for example, to retrieve information pertaining to user accounts on a local system. It can also be used to get a list of user accounts on a remote system as well. RansomHub ransomware uses this function to enumerate local accounts, and it was designed specifically for that attack graph that we released this quarter. And then similarly for Hunters International, enum service status W was a scenario for that was designed so that we could get a list of active services on a local machine. Similarly, there were new command execution based scenarios created this quarter. For example, Medusa uses driver query to get which is a command line utility in Windows to get a list of drivers, and they do that to determine if there are vulnerable or signed drivers available to kill or delete endpoint protection and response tools. And also, WMI scenarios have been created this quarter. Specifically, one was created for Medusa for doing some recon related to printers and printers that are located within the environment. And lastly, things that you can do to kind of protect yourself from these groups is, defense in depth. Make sure that your backups are segmented. They're either offsite or offline, or you're protecting them by using different authentication schemes from the rest of your enterprise environment. For example, you're using MFA where applicable. Endpoint detection and response tools obviously are very important to any security strategy. And then testing as well with a breach and attack simulation.
Yeah, actually, yeah, just on that last point, yeah, I mean, you know, obviously everything on this slide is super important, and it's a complex, it's a complex space. There's no kind of silver bullet, but yeah, EDR particularly of an area of interest, particularly around ransomware. It's often the endpoint where the ransomware finally detonates on. But obviously, breach and attack simulation enables customers to be able to proactively run this content in production, hopefully before they become a victim themselves, and that then buys time in figuring out where those gaps are, and then hopefully mitigating or maybe generating new detection rules or modifying existing detection rules to make sure that you have that visibility to begin with. So last up, so lots of headlines in 2025. So again, this year is already shaping up to be undoubtedly yet another year threatened by even more ransomware groups and players. Some examples of this in recent times have been, or at least from what we've seen, is fog ransomware, termite ransomware, Lynx ransomware, GD LockerSec, Morpheus, Hellcat. The list goes on, and I'm sure it just won't end anytime soon. But ultimately, this is why we do what we do here in the Adversary research team. Our mission is to release, as I said before, timely, actionable content to help organizations safely test and validate their controls in production. So yeah, certainly stay tuned for upcoming content releases. We have quite a lot of new stuff, not even just in the format of ransomware specifically, but obviously we're only really talking today about one type of threat, which is ransomware. But there's obviously been a recent high interest in information stealers, and we're also looking quite close to actually releasing some new capabilities. So this year is definitely shaping up to be quite an exciting year, which will not only kind of benefit us, but also benefit our customers, because they'll have new ways of testing more advanced and sophisticated content. In addition to that, we have also been putting out flex packages as well. So historically, we've had many flex packages that have been released when Flex was first launched, but we're also now kind of releasing flex packages on a relatively regular cadence. So for those Flex customers or those that haven't tried Flex yet, this is a brilliant agentless way of testing and getting your hands dirty before kind of maybe progressing up to our other enterprise kind of level options. And with that, I think, Liz, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yes, we do. We do have a couple of questions.
Yeah, I can see. So I can see the first one was somebody asked, so how soon after a new threat is reported can AttackIQ release new content for it? So yeah, great question. So there's probably a bit of a misconception that, let's say, for instance, a certain media outlet might claim that, there's some new threat or some ransomware group that we should all be concerned about, and maybe we should be, but the misconception really is that that doesn't instantly equate to the Adversary research team just being able to, create scenarios, right? We need to have evidence. It needs to be backed up by detailed reporting, actual real world adversary behaviors. So the answer really to that question is it depends. So, sometimes, quite often we see this with CISA alerts, the advisories, sorry. But when CISA publish an advisory, a lot of that information is quite often actionable, and therefore, we will always strive to release something, as quickly as we can. But other times, and this really just comes down to the research that goes into it. So it could be that an EDR vendor only has certain telemetry that they see on the endpoint side, or maybe there could be a firewall vendor that has seen network-based attacks, and therefore their bias is towards the network side of the intrusion. So we try and formulate a much bigger picture of the overall attack or the campaign, over time. So it's not really a kind of a hard and fast rule, but we'll always act once we feel we have adequate enough information. And then I can see another question here. So why does the adversary research team sometimes release atomic assessments and other times release attack graphs? So again, really great question. And again, it kind of goes back to the previous question, actually. So in the case of Lockbit, which Ian spoke about, Lockbit, there just wasn't really a lot of new information in the public domain, at least for Lockbit version 4.0. Other older versions of Lockbit, yes, it's pretty well documented. But when a new version comes out, you kind of expect eventually to hear some intrusions or some incident response write-ups, and that hasn't really happened yet, at least not what we've seen. So, we have to, trust but verify our sources. We need to make sure that the information is accurate and it's good. And obviously we have our own lab environment where we do, manual detonation. We do our own reverse engineering to kind of cross-check report results and write-ups before we release an assessment. So I guess the simple way of answering the question is it really, again, depends. So if there's a lack of intelligence, if there's a lack of actionable information from those reports, or maybe even perhaps from our own analysis, then we would typically try and include, as many scenarios as we can in the form of an atomic assessment. So at least that is a starting point. But, over time, as new information comes to light and as we start to kind of place the final pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, then that might then lead eventually to an attack graph. So so hopefully that's answered the question. And I think that was the final question. So again, I just want to both from myself and Ian, thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you found this useful. Hope you've enjoyed the talk and we've enjoyed having you. So thanks again for your time, and I'll hand back over to Liz.
Thank you everyone for joining. I am going to add a link in the chat if anybody is interested in testing their defenses against these types of adversaries. AttackIQ Flex is a great way to do that. You can start testing for free. I'm adding that link in the chat for you now. And thank you all for joining us. We hope you have a great day. I'll leave it up for a minute so you guys can grab that link, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you.